So this is a bit of a recap video of just the last month. I just wanted to kind of have an idea of how many things I've done over the last month in terms of reviews, and I realize many people don't really have the time to watch everything or see everything, and it's just a bit of a way for me to just collate everything I've kind of put together, or just for me personally, it's just for me to remember what the things I've done in a way that maybe I can think more back on it more a bit and all that stuff. So I made 21 videos in June. There are, let me see, 11 music reviews, one Prince 80s, I kind of ranked my favorite 80s Prince albums, one more in-depth analysis of Ye, and then I made one video on X passing away, I had 6 book reviews, and one kind of video about the books that I've been reading, I'm reading right now. So there are 21 videos. I think they're all kind of very interesting to certain degrees, but I guess I want to just maybe get a bit of a recap over the things over so far. So, five of those, so four of those music reviews were the Kanye album. So I did pick Daytona as well before, but then I did 4 reviews of the Kanye albums, or these the Wyoming albums, and my favorite one is Ye, which I made a more in-depth review of because I think it's very interesting to see his more personal life kind of fleshed out in a way that's very uniquely, sonically and thematically outlined in a way that I don't really necessarily get with most albums. So I love those mini album experiences, although, you know, they're not necessarily all of my favorite albums of the year. You know, I like all of them to varying degrees, and I've listened to them a lot more since talking about them initially. My favorite one is definitely Ye, and the others kind of fall somewhere in my top 15 or so albums of the year so far. My favorite album of the year so far is one of the things I reviewed. My favorite one so far is Death Grips Year of the Snitch. You know, I talked about this last week, and I'm just a big Death Grips fan, so I talked about that, and how much I really felt like it was just part of my own experience of me loving the journey of these Death Grips albums put me in terms of a sonical journey that I never get in other kinds of music. And I guess another sonical journey that I very much appreciated and enjoyed was that of Sophie's album, definitely in my top 5 or 10 albums of the year for sure as well. Not that the rankings, and honestly rankings don't matter, this is just a personal thing for me. I kind of want to, at least for the albums I want to revisit more, Sophie's album is incredible. If you haven't listened to it, listen to it. And you know, I did some other more random stuff. I reviewed Jimmy Wopo's album. Jimmy Wopo is one of the person who is the rapper who died the same day as X. I listened to his last album, or his last mixtape, and I gave my thoughts about that. And then there's one about X. I just gave a kind of understanding more about the perspective, just my own reaction to the death of X, and I kind of just talk about the difficulty in kind of embracing him as well as trying to deal with his music. And mostly I was trying to be very positive about it to some degree, but still I wanted to be somewhat open to the idea that what he represented was not so much about him, but about the people who listened to him, and that says more about them than about that we should have more focus on the people who were big fans of him and what that kind of represented about the new generation of fans. Less about him as a person, but more about his fan base, and the kinds of music that he was making is more interesting, I think, for me to separate from the person himself. So that's just personally me. What other music stuff I did? Amazing Hindustani classical album by this Sarangi player called Narayan. He is this Indian guy who I think he lives in LA or something, but he has this album where he plays a lot of these songs with this instrument called the Sarangi, which is like a violin that apparently the instrument is supposed to be one of the instrument that most closely resembles the human voice. So he has a whole album of it, and he's supposed to be one of the greatest Sarangi players of all time. So I highly recommend that album. You don't even have to, don't watch my thing. Just check this guy out, Narayan. You'll see it in the videos. I talked about Shawn Mendes because I don't listen to pop music, and I wanted to just explore what pop sounds like today. And I checked out the Shawn Mendes album, which I was pleasantly surprised with. Ski Mask is God. I'm trying to listen to a bunch of these XXL artists. None of them I really listen to normally, so I wanted to learn more about them. And after seeing their freshman freestyles, I did Ski Mask, and later tonight I'm going to listen for the very first time. I'm listening to Lil Pump's album, which I'm kind of looking forward to, even though, you know, it's Lil Pump. I'm sure he's very controversial. People don't really think he makes good music, for some people at least. So there's that. In terms of books, I read a lot of different kinds of books this month. I talked about Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson, which is this book about this guy who thinks that one of the more interesting things, or one of the more important things that people should do is try to get out of their ways of their kind of, I forgot the term he uses, but essentially it's how we more modernly use the word of the thought, the ideological bubble of sorts, or we have, not really ideological bubble, but there are like certain ways of just thinking about the world that we are always, we don't necessarily understand, that is very one track minded, and it's important to open that up by engaging with just the multitude of ways of thinking in all sorts of things. It's a very interesting book. Robert Anton Wilson. I read Jorge Luis Borges' Ficciones, which is a short story collection from this very popular Argentine fiction writer who's a kind of a surrealist sometimes, but he writes about all these, he's very metatextual, and he writes a lot about stories about like he writes weird, these kinds of short stories supposedly, but they are commentaries on like they're fake commentaries about fake books about real things. It's just he does a lot of metatextual things that are quite interesting, and I love a lot of his stories about infinity. Very interesting. Just read some of his short stories online, or check out the review or something. I talk about my favorite short stories on that collection. I read Aldous Huxley's Stories of Perception and Heaven and Hell. These are these two pieces of writing about the psychedelic experience by Aldous Huxley, the author of The Brave New World, which I haven't actually read, but he's a famous author. He's one of the most influential thinkers in the mid-20th century about the effects of or he was just a big proponent on psychedelics, and he talks about it in this book, in these two books, and he delineates what it could possibly represent, or how it actually seems to work in the human body, and he gives these very interesting theories. I also read H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, which is this science fiction book from 1895, one of the very first sci-fi books, fantasy books about time travel. I think it's the book that actually created the term time machine. Like the word time machine comes from H.G. Wells' book. It's a really good book, even though it was written so long ago. It feels very contemporary still. I talked about Steven Pinker. I maybe like a third of Enlightenment Now I talked about, because I was still reading it and I thought it was important to put the first third of the book or something into kind of perspective. And I just talked about my thoughts on Enlightenment Now and Steven Pinker and this whole movement towards optimism and ways of thinking about the world in which not everything sucks, but things are actually getting better in many different ways, which there have been many books about it being written recently, like Factfulness, for example. But yeah, I'm reading Enlightenment Now. That's pretty much it, I think. Well, okay, so Carl Wilson's Let's Talk About Love. I talked about this book that I read a few months ago, but then it's about how people come up with the idea of taste. What is good taste? What is bad taste? Where does taste come from? Very interesting book, which is actually, it was originally from this series called 33 and a Third, and he wrote about Celine Dion's album Let's Talk About Love. I think it's the album that has My Heart Will Go On from the Titanic soundtrack, which she won the Oscars Best Song for. So he talks about the book. It's very about the album and about Celine Dion and about taste in general. It's very psychological, and it's a very interesting book. And finally, the other day I talked about Kanye West's 808s and Heartbreaks, which is one of my recently better appreciated Kanye West albums. I haven't listened to it in probably several years in its entirety, so I listened to it again over the other day. Instead of listening to Scorpion, because I was getting tired of Scorpion, I wanted to listen to other things, so I listened to 808s and Heartbreak again, and I just appreciated it a lot more, and I gave lots of my thoughts on the album and its influence on everything else, and why it's probably one of the more influential albums of the 21st century so far. So yeah, that's a recap of June. I've unfortunately I haven't really talked about any films this month. I've been really slow with movies lately. But I got a good mix of books and different varieties of books and music. I probably don't want to keep talking about new music, though. I want to talk about music that perhaps are not as well known, but I want to do that eventually. But lots of interesting stuff. I highly recommend a lot of the music that I was able to listen to and books that I've read. And whenever I make a video, that means it's a lot of it is because I think the books are worth reading or music is worth listening to. So hopefully you check some of those out.